we were, starting from where we were last time. I set up a very simple model of the choice by an adult. Remember, up until then, we had been speaking mainly about parental investment in children, but at some point, children themselves become adults. And they make their, they make their own decisions, basically. What we have showed was that what type of decisions they make may well be influenced by a number of things from that the parents did to them or affected them with, such as the amount they invested in their human capital and their preferences for old age support. Now that interacts with the amount parents invest in their human capital. So, and we were able to derive actually some fairly precise results about that, and you went over that in the problem session on last Friday, right? So anybody have any questions about any of that material? Okay. So then, let's continue with what we began last time on the choice between whether people go to college or not. You can think of that as any continuation in their schooling, but the college-high school decision is a really important one, and growing importance in the world as a whole, including many poorer countries and certainly in all rich countries. So it's good to visualize what we're doing in terms of college-high school, though, as I said, you can interpret that in just continuation of an additional year or a group of years of education. And what we saw that if you ask yourself the question, question, do I go to college? Is the value that they equal less than high school, right? We saw that we can, assuming, and this is a strong assumption, assuming that what people are trying to do is maximize the present value of their earnings. And we're going to deal with that the whole today, but we'll deal with a more general treatment afterwards. But actually, taking this simpler treatment, we can cover a lot of interesting issues. Not all, but a lot of interesting issues without having to deal with a more general treatment. And they come out more explicitly and more clearly, this formulation. We can see that reduced to the condition whether the sum of P times delta Wi Ri, R to the I running from 1 to M was greater or equal less than WH times T minus T. WH, yeah, right. the benefits. What are the costs, right? So it's a discounted, or we have delta W, delta Wi is simply W college at HI minus W high school at HI, right? That runs from 1 to the M periods. R, 1 over 1 plus R, that's the discount factor. T is the hours of work. And so that's the benefit, discounted benefits. What are the costs? Well, this is the amount of time you spend in college. So your foregone earnings is your time. I'm assuming you could be earning the same as a high school person would earn in that first initial period. Foregone earnings. And this is tuition and fees. Right? So you go to college if the benefits are greater, you don't go if they're less, and so on. Okay? So I want to discuss then 6 variables here. We'll treat them as parameters from the point of view of our discussion here, although some of them are clearly endogenous. What are they? Well, there's M, life expectancy. M plus 1 is actually life expectancy. T, hours worked. R, discount rate. Delta W, benefits of college. T, C, hours of college, foregone earnings, and F, tuition. So I have 6 variables, right? I think, if you want, you can introduce W H naught also. So you can make W H naught. This would be then foregone earnings. Okay. Those are our variables. And so what I will do is discuss each of them in turn. Now, for example, what's the role of life expectancy? Well, we have here a very simple model of life, that you live for M plus 1 years and then you die. Okay, so with that model, we can see very explicitly, well, you can see it there, but suppose it were true, suppose delta W I equals delta W I equals 1 to M, right? So then we can write this as what? As T delta W times R minus R to the M plus 1 over 1 minus R greater than or equal to 4 by 1 plus F. Okay? Right? So in that case, which is a good case to look at, you can see the greater M, R is less than 1 because it's 1 over 1, it's a discount rate. So the greater M, the smaller you're subtracting from here, and therefore the bigger our benefits, and therefore we know that, let's say, the C minus TB, that's so you increase the college earning relative to the college value relative to the high school value. Okay. Now a nicer way to treat this would be to say, well, instead of just having a fixed life expectancy, you have some rate of dying at each age. So then you can think of if for example, you don't die in the initial period, and then MI, the probability of dying at age I, and you maximize, let's say, expected discounted earnings, Okay? Then you would have sum T MI. Right, so MI is the same in all education groups. It could be a function, delta I R I greater than or less than 4 plus F, right? And then the higher, I'm sorry, this should be 1 minus MI. Survivorship rate. What you're worried about is whether you survive, right? So your survivorship rate. So the higher MI, smaller the survivorship rate, the lower is the discounted benefits expected, and therefore less likely you to do it. In that sense, it's similar, but look, you would say, well, if this is the formulation, up here, M is 60 years or so, when you go to 60 to 61, it's going to have a pretty trivial effect. Right? On the other hand, if you think of this formulation, where you're dying, let's say, even at much earlier ages, that, say you're dying at age 85, and then you change to 86, it's not going to have much effect in your send to invest in college, right? It's so heavily discounted. 5% interest rate, 5% discount rate, trivial effect. On the other hand, here, if you're dying at different ages, then yes, if all these M's are only in the future, if you don't die until age 65, which is part of the reality of the modern world, it's not going to have that much of an effect. It'll have more of an effect than the other, but it won't have such a big effect. On the other hand, if you're in an environment like where AIDS is very prevalent, as in Africa, I just came from a talk on the incidence of AIDS in different African countries, and as everybody knows, it's pretty high in many African countries, like Ghana, South Africa, and others. And that AIDS hits young people, not older people. So here having an increase in the mortality at young ages. By young, I mean the 20s, the 30s, the 40s, 50s, where then it's going to kick in much more. You're not going to be discounting that so much. So a significant increase in your prospects of dying, assuming it's the same at different education levels, could significantly reduce your benefits of going to college. And a study by Jane Forts, and others, but I know her study, show that there's some evidence that in regions, she doesn't have individuals and whether they get AIDS or not, that's a weakness, but in areas where AIDS has a higher incidence, people invest less in schooling. Could go to some other variables. Okay. Not exactly, by any means exactly what you would like to have, but she finds that. Okay. Other people looked at other data. And it makes sense that this should have an effect on people's incentives to invest. Okay? So, life expectancy, mortality rates make a difference. Now we're going to add another modification, but not now, where we'll endogenize your life expectancy because you'll invest in your health. So we want to do that. I'm just not going to do that now. Because you can see how if you can lower your mortality rate, well, that's good even if you're not investing in college, right? Right? People prefer to live to, I'm assuming, so a theorist will say, well, you're assuming that people prefer living to dying. And yeah, I'm making that assumption. Right? Because if they didn't, they could easily make themselves die. So assuming that people prefer living to dying, this has a value to you, and people invest in it. Now, it could also be interacting with your incentive to invest in education, so now it becomes a little more interesting, and in fact, one can show in general it does. But I'll hold that for now. Any questions on this? Okay. So that's factor number one. So let me do it by factors. 1. M or MI. Okay? 2. T. T are hours worked. We just take that as exogenous. In reality, T is going to be endogenous. People can affect their hours of work. Right. Let's assume for the moment, but you know, whatever decision they make about hours of work, we'll show this, we'll prove this later on, but it should be, you should be able to understand this sort of reasoning. Whatever optimal decision they're making about hours of work, when they come to choosing their education, they, like any other partial derivative, looking for first order conditions, they take that as given, even though it's an endogenous decision. Right? So their incentive to invest in college education is going to be affected by their hours of work, even though hours of work was endogenous. Okay? And vice versa, of course. Incentive to spend more hours is affected by your education. So now I'm taking as given. I'm going to talk about changes in it. Okay? You understand what I'm saying? Okay. So clearly, obvious from this, the higher your hours of work, the greater is the gain from going to college. So you're multiplying a wage gain by a bigger gain. So for example, you go to medical school and you work a couple of hours a week, you're not going to be able to pay for the very extensive cost of going to medical school. First, in the United States and in Europe, you can go to medical school directly from high school for 5 or 6 years or so. U.S., you can't do that. You have to go for your 4 years of undergraduate and then your medical school. So that gives you 8 years. All right, even if you're going to go to college anyway, you have 4 additional years plus your internship, your residency. Now you're going to work about 1 or 2 hours a week. It's not a good investment. I mean, maybe it's a good investment. You'll meet some other doctor and your family. We'll bring that in. We'll bring in the gain for marriage later on. That might be a good investment. But in terms of formulation now, for the individual, it's not a good investment. Okay? So you generally find people make a lot of investments in a human capital, tend to work a lot of hours. And in general, more educated people work longer hours and less educated people. And then, you see part-time physicians, particularly women caring for young children are often part-time until the children get old, and then they go to full-time. But there's a cost doing it. Benefit, I mean, they like to care for their children, but there's a cost to doing it, okay? Now, traditionally, you had 2 observations that are, I think, very much linked. One, women were much less likely to go to college than men. So, for example, in 1970, in the U.S., comparable numbers in other countries, 40% of 4-year degrees went to women. And you look at things like medicine, so MD degrees, MBAs, LLB, law degrees, etc., many fewer women. Well, one interpretation of that is related to the fact that women were much less likely to be in the labor force than men, and to work fewer hours than men, even among more educated women. So if T is smaller, maybe not 0, maybe a part-time, or 0 at certain times, then the benefits are going to be reduced. So one explanation for this fact that women didn't go to college so much, and particularly didn't finish so much. Many women started but dropped out to get married. And they didn't go to graduate school so much, particularly in areas with a very heavy investment like medicine, law, or business, or other science, or a lot of other fields. That they didn't do it because they were expecting to spend a much larger part of their time in the household than in the marketplace. Okay? So that would be the human capital interpretation of two things that we see then, even till to this day, but even more strongly in the past, that women got less education than men, and particularly advanced education post-college, and their earnings were a lot less than men's. I mean, those are facts. One interpretation of that is that was because of fertility was higher, in particular, and for other reasons, women didn't work so much as men, and therefore it didn't pay for them to go to college. Now, there's been a fight that's gone on over the years between that and another interpretation, and you know, there's truth to both of them. That, well, yes, but women were blocked from going to medical school because of discrimination and from getting good positions in business or getting admitted to law school. So women didn't go for those advanced degrees in part, maybe major part, because of discrimination. Now, you can also say women didn't work as much or earn less than men because of discrimination in the marketplace, and maybe that would explain probably why women didn't go to college as much, and it could explain also why they didn't work as much. They're earning less, they're in a marital context, you have division of labor, there's a person earning less, tends to spend more of the time in the household. Okay? So, you know, a priori one can't rule out either of these interpretations. My own view is that there was discrimination, and unquestionable. I think there's good evidence, but that the human capital story has to be an important part of the story as well. Now, they can interact. So if there's discrimination, you don't invest, you don't work as much, so, you know, they could be complementary stories. But somehow you have to end up with less work. Has to be some significant part of the story if you're going to understand what's going on. But it could be induced by these other factors. Okay? But well, in general, full-time workers are going to have more incentive to invest in more education, more human capital more generally. People are out of the labor force, don't have much incentive to invest in human capital that's market-oriented. Maybe they'll invest in human capital that's non-market-oriented. We don't have that in this yet. But we'll get into that. Okay? But in terms of market-oriented human capital, they don't have much incentive to invest, clearly. Any questions? Yes?
In the first story, what changed in the last 30 years?
Okay, good question. Do you have any ideas? Take the first story. Forget discrimination for the moment. But you can always say discrimination was low or government laws came into being, right? What about the first story?
Birth control is part of it, maybe?
Well, we know for one thing birth rates went down a lot as you go from, say, the 50s to the 70s. Significant reduction in birth rates, not only in the United States, but in almost all countries. So I would say yes, decline in birth rates. Now, why they went down? Maybe the pill was developed, but there are a bunch of reasons why birth rates went down. Second factor, divorce rates started up in the 60s. So a person, particularly a woman who's going to be on her own, yeah, she may get some child support and so on, but she's going to be on her own to a large extent financially. She has to worry about, well, how's she going to be able to take care of herself if she's going to be single. So these are a couple of the forces that one would mention. I think they were important. Now, there are also, maybe the thing that leads me to believe there clearly was discrimination. I mean, it's easy to claim it, but what you find in something like law school and medical school is there weren't admitted many women. All of a sudden, sort of the dam breaks and women start coming in. So when you see something like a dam breaking like that, what was the force that was preventing it before? It wasn't some continuous variable that was operating. So I think there was discrimination that was finally broken down, either by legislation or for other reasons, I don't know. That's the way I would give the second story. So the first story is straightforward. I mean, also, you have very clear variables that would lead women to make, even in a family decision-making context, to change their decision about household time versus market time. Okay, didn't have as many children to take care of. Yes, they may have increased their investment in the quality of children, as we'll come to later on, but still they had more free time. They had to be worried more about being on their own and supporting themselves, and that led them to make more of a commitment to the labor force. Any other questions?
What about like child care? You know, the fact that 60% of families now have children in non-parental care. You know, is that like kind of a discrimination story?
What do you mean by non-parental care? Meaning child care facilities?
Yeah, or like a relative, or you know.
Yeah, well, you know, I don't know if 60% is right. For some groups, it's right. I mean, there are a lot of families where, when the child is born, there's only one parent in the family. And that parent may be working, so they have to look for other care. On the other hand, we also know that in the two parent families, when a child is born, often usually the mother takes time off from work, help take care of the children early, and then they use some outside care. All right, so what's your question about that?
So would that have a role to play? Like if that is a developing, you know, sector, then women could go and work? Or did that take place because now women are not discriminated against, and therefore?
Yeah, okay, you posed the question right. I tend to think of it as mainly endogenous, that women wanted to go more into the labor force. You know, in a market economy, markets develop if there's a demand. I mean, that's the basic principle. Now, the one factor you can mention is there was some increase, particularly in some countries like Scandinavia, some European countries, and some other countries, in the amount of subsidy for child care facilities. So that would tend to push, you know, that would make it cheaper and push more women into the labor force. So in a country like Sweden, you find a larger fraction of women, not necessarily working at any time, but with a job than in the United States. So Sweden not only has subsidized child care, Sweden greatly subsidizes parents who take leave from work to care for newborn children. So both of these are subsidized. So the second case, you have a lot of people who aren't at work, but they have a job because the company is required to give them a job back when they come back. They're not working. So I think for those two reasons, Sweden has a large fraction of women who have jobs, and they get both benefits, child care benefit and the maternity benefit. So I think the United States has been mainly endogenous, although we do have a subsidy program, particularly for the lower income, help out in child care of the lower income families. For other countries, that's a more important factor. Okay. Anything else?
The discrimination story and the human capital story, for the reason that, you know, if you think that there's some dam that broke at some point, it likely broke because people started wanting to pursue human capital more. So, you know, if no women really wanted to become doctors, they wouldn't have as much incentive to, you know, try to change laws and things like that. So it seems like you might be able to distinguish the stories if you could tell whether, you know, the changes in the variables preempted the discrimination law changes, or?
Well, the law change in the United States started occurring in the early 1960s. Civil rights legislation, various types of anti-discrimination legislation at the federal level. The dam began to break on these postgraduate things in the 70s. So maybe you could trace it from the law changes. But then you'd have to have a decade lag before it was really operating. Maybe it could. It takes time to plan for this and so on. So it's a little, it's a little difficult to use simply the timing unless it's if the law changed today and tomorrow the dam broke, you'd think, well, that's the law. The law changed today and a decade later the dam breaks. It's a little more complicated to know what's going on. Right? Now this was 1970. 2010, what are the comparable numbers? Anybody? Six. Approximately. A little less, so that's good enough. what's interesting about these numbers, up to a point these numbers aren't surprising, but beyond that they're quite surprising. By up to a point, I would say, well, women are working more in the labor force for the reasons, whatever reasons. The hours of work are greater, they're making more of a commitment to the labor force. Therefore, that T, the big T variable, should be less important, okay? But that should bring women and men closer together. But what you've seen is now you're sort of inverted the thing. You went from 40-60 to 60-40. So what's doing it now? Why are women so much more likely to get a 4-year degree than men? Okay? It's a challenging question. Well, you say, well, the wage differentials are higher for women. Right, that's been a story that people have given, but William Hubbard, a student in the department, has shown pretty conclusively that that story is not right because they didn't, there's an issue when estimating the average income of, say, college graduates, of how many people are in the open-end interval, the top-coded interval, like over $60,000 or so. And what average you give for that interval makes a big difference for college graduates because a lot of people are in that interval. And so most people took too low an estimate for that. You do it correctly, they don't see any evidence that women's gains are greater than men. Women are still less in the labor force than men, so the T factor, if anything, goes against women. They have lower mortality rates, but most of that kicks in later ages, so it doesn't have a big effect on present value. So what's the reason? I mean, it's a challenge to explain why this is so. And don't give me a reason that's special to the United States, because this is a general phenomena that's true in almost every wealthy country of the world, and in some non-wealthy countries, like Iran, for example. You wouldn't expect it, but it's true in Iran, it's true in Kuwait, and a whole bunch of other countries that are not rich countries. I mean, Kuwait's rich, but it's Muslim. Women only got to vote in Kuwait about 10 years ago. So you would think there's discrimination against women, and yet there are women in higher education than men. They don't work that much either. Even more of a puzzle. But it's true. Same thing for Iran. Married women in Iran don't work so much, but a lot of them are enrolled at universities. So why is this? Well, I'm going to come back to that. Think about it, because I think it's a challenging question to try to explain that. Okay. Three. R. Discount. Clearly, the higher the discount and the smaller R, the more you're discounting future earnings, the higher the interest rate, the less the advantage of investing in any long-lived investment. And education is a prime example of a long-lived investment. It helps you not only now, but it helps you throughout all or most of your lifetime. Okay. Now we have had low interest rates in the past couple of decades, and education has boomed during these decades. So part of it may be due to low interest rates. Okay. In general, I don't mean for women versus men. Education, higher education of everybody has boomed in the world substantially during the last couple of decades. Okay, since 1970. And I'll come back. Document that. Okay. So it's partly for that reason. Now, if we have capital market imperfections, it's hard to really bring them into the way we formulate it precisely. It's hard to bring them in precisely in the way we formulated the analysis thus far. Because then, if for the group who are subject to these perfections, you don't want to make R equal to, say, the return on capital, right? Because for some people have to finance their own investment. The only way they can go to college is by consuming a little when they're in college. And that's a cost, utility cost to people. If you could borrow easily, so you don't have to lower your consumption while you're in college and pay it back when you're earning more, then it'd be easier from a utility perspective to go to college. And we don't have utility in this analysis, so we have to sort of finesse that issue a little bit with this formulation. So what I will say is that people who are faced with stronger capital imperfections face smaller R's, higher interest rates, smaller capital R's, higher interest rates. They discount the future effectively more. So that's kind of equivalent to what happens with capital imperfections. Not exactly what happens. And therefore, those people, let's say from poorer backgrounds, for example, are less likely to invest in college. We know that's true. Whether this is the main story, one has to investigate, but it's certainly true they're more likely to invest in college. Okay, so that's the way you can think of it now. That you can have R, instead of being a number, we can attach R sub, let's say some J individuals, and the if the individuals, some individuals have, let's say the higher J's have more easy access to capital, we would then say that VR J is less than 0. If higher, I'm sorry, greater than 0, if higher J's have more access to capital. Right? I mean, all I'm saying there is that capital imperfections will affect your discount rate. Okay? Any questions about that? Yeah? You have a question? All right, the fourth factor I'm going to talk about changing the order slightly here. Cost. Foregone earnings. Tuition. Costs. Okay? Well, obviously costs are going to be important. The main cost of going to college is actually foregone earnings, for the most part. That, I mean, in very expensive private colleges, then it becomes, pretty close. Sometimes then maybe the tuition is greater. So if you go into a business school where tuition is $50,000 a year, let's say, that's roughly what it is, and then you have living expenses, another $20,000 a year, let's say. Well, then you have $70,000 cost. Now, were you earning more than $70,000? Some people were, some people weren't, so it might be close. But for the vast majority of people in most countries, the biggest cost of going to university is foregone earnings. A lot of countries have zero tuition. Students live at home. That may be a cost to their parents, but when they may not take that into account fully, although it could be internalized. But let's say we treat that as a really minor cost. And the main cost is their foregone earnings. They're not earning. And it's true in the United States, too. The United States is more, students tend to work more when they're in college than in a lot of other countries, and we have tuition that, particularly at private universities, is sizable, even in some state universities, because it's not negligible, for out-of-staters in particular. But still, foregone earnings is a dominant cost, all right? So that's what people are really giving up. So when we calculate in national income accounts the cost, how much is spent on education, let's say we calculate for the United States. Calculate. For U.S., maybe 8% of GDP education. K plus. That means kindergarten and up, okay, through postgraduate education. That doesn't count foregone earnings. So that's a error, you might say, an oversight in national income calculations, because foregone earnings are important. Not maybe at K to 8th grade, it's negative because the teachers are like babysitters, right? So they're providing that service. As you get to high school, foreign earnings begin to become important. That's why a lot of students, particularly in poorer countries, drop out of school and high school to go to work and earn some income. Okay, I discussed that earlier when I discussed Progressa in Mexico and other similar programs. It's true in all countries when they were poorer. It's still true in countries like China and India and Mexico and elsewhere. So in high school it becomes, and then in university it becomes even higher. So the only way we get rid of students eventually is their foregone earnings rise so much. They figure there's only so much they're willing to pay for being a undergraduate or a graduate student. And they have to go into the real world and work, unless they become a teacher, and they can avoid that. But it's sizable. The usual estimates for the United States are that foregone earnings have been about 3/4 of total cost. Total private cost. Total private cost. Because again, you have to make the distinction between what I'm paying as a student and what is being paid in the aggregate. If, let's say, you go to Germany and the government is paying for the cost of educating students in higher education, and tuition is pretty low, maybe now negligible, then for the student's point of view, there's no direct cost. They have their foregone earnings. But for society, they're investing that much in education, and they have to take that into account from that point of view. But from the student's point of view, they don't have to take that into account. So I say 3/4, I mean 3/4 of the cost to the student is approximately the cost. And that's also netting out the fact that many students work during the summer and otherwise, and they earn some money. Okay. So whenever you talk about cost, either at the private level or at the country level, you have to think of foregone earnings as an important component of it. Okay. And time allocation is just a very important part of the problem. Now note the following. Suppose everything was foregone earnings, so tuition is 0. So let's say f is 0. Let's go back to our basic equation up here. Okay? Okay, so we have, go back to our basic equation. I'll do it over here. Sum t delta WI RI greater than or equal to WH 0 TC plus F. Set F equal to 0. So the only expense, that's often a pretty good approximation. Now divide through by W. So we get WT delta WI over WH naught times RI greater than or equal to TC. Okay? Now let's look at this term. Write this term. Suppose let W equal so every year you get the same amount in college and high school, and so that means WH naught equals WH. Dividing that, then we have delta W over WH is equal to WC over WH minus 1. Okay? So what does this say? Well, under these conditions, it says one thing, well, you can use the ratio of college high school earnings as a measure of the return from going to college. Not the rate of return, but the return from going to college. And in a lot of empirical studies, that's what's used. You run a logarithmic equation, log wages in schooling, so you're using the ratio of the wages as your measure. Okay? Number two, from an analytical point of view, it says the following. Suppose you come along and the government comes along and imposes a flat tax, income tax of 20%. Okay, so it taxes all income by 20%. What does that do to the incentive to invest in college education? Christina, Jang, you know?
I think it would decrease the incentive.
So it would decrease the incentive. Is that what you're saying? Look at those equations.
Okay, so what you're saying would change?
It would increase or it wouldn't change at all. We have three options. You can't take all three.
Yeah, it wouldn't change
Why?
because it would cancel out in that ratio.
Yeah, because nothing is, I mean, put it from this point of view, if this is 0, we put a tax on, what does a tax do? And we don't even have to make that assumption, this assumption here. Take this more general statement. What does a tax do in that case? Okay, let's write it down. Well, it means if it's a flat tax, it means you multiply the earnings that I'm getting. Let's say tau is the tax rate. I'm only getting 1 minus tau. So then I'm putting a tax on, I would say 1 minus tau times delta Wi Ri, okay, is greater than or equal to 1 minus tau times WH naught TC, assuming F equals 0 again, right? The taus drop out. Taus drop out. And in that case, flat income tax has no effect on the incentive to invest. And the reasoning is what? You're taxing foregone earnings. Also, So in other words, what you're giving up in earnings is reduced because you're not getting as much. That's being taxed. So you're giving up, let's say, 20% in foregone earnings. So your foregone earnings are reduced by 20%. Your benefits are reduced by 20%. And therefore, the decision whether you go or not is unaffected. And in V0, the present value of your earnings are affected. But it's affected the same way for college and high school graduates. And doesn't change the decision of which one is greater than the other. That's the way to look. I'm not saying a tax doesn't affect the present value of earnings. It does. I mean, even that's got, I mean, it does. I mean, it may not affect your real income if it's redistributed, but it affects your present value of earnings. Okay? That it does. And I'm not having even any adjustment in capital T. That might be affected. But for a given T, it has no effect. Right? Now, if there are two extensions where it will have an effect. Right? One is if there's tuition costs. Why? Because then tuition costs aren't taxed. Tuition isn't taxed unless you're getting some kind of credit for it. And so costs are falling by less than the tax rate. Total costs would not fall by 20%. So let's take the opposite extreme. All your costs are tuition. There's no foregone earnings. Well, the only thing that's changing is your left-hand side is going down by 20%. Your right-hand side, then, if it's only tuition, isn't changing at all, right? And therefore, you're what? You're worse off. You're worse off by the tax. That's one condition, right? What's another condition? You had a question?
Yes, I was just going to ask though, that scenario in which there's only tuition and no foregone earnings, is that really imaginable? I mean, because time is a finite resource, so if you go to college by definition, there are foregone earnings involved no matter what.
Well, but they may be compensated. I mean, think of it the following way. You're going to college, you're spending time there. But the college says to you, you're giving up like $30,000 by coming here. We'll give you a fellowship for that $30,000. Yeah. So you have to think of that kind of an experiment. You're right. I mean, realistically, you're usually going to have foregone earnings, right? But I'm trying to give you a conceptual experiment. And that, I just did that in the extreme case. You don't need that assumption. As long as there's some tuition, this effect goes through. On any tuition, whatever your foregone earnings are. Okay? As long as it's a flat tax. Okay?
Are we going to move to the example of a progressive tax? Because,
all right, now take a progressive tax. What does that do?
that would decrease the incentive to go to college.
Why is that?
Look at higher expected future earnings, you're going to be taxed more heavily in the future as a result.
Yeah, right. So here we just can't look at the wage differential multiplied by a tax rate. You'd have to say, well, we look at, what we want to look at is 1 minus tau, the marginal tax rate for tau is going to be a function. I'll do it correctly. Tau is going to be a function now of the wages. Okay? So it's going to be 1 minus tau wages given college graduates minus 1 minus tau wages for high school graduates at a particular age, I. And if it's progressive tax, and if WC is greater than WH, then a progressive tax means that tau prime is greater than 0. The tax rate goes up as you increase the earnings. So in that case, you can see this term here is going to, this term, now we have to multiply times W, CI, multiply this times W, CI. So this term here is going to be smaller with the regressive tax than this term here. Okay? Because college graduates earn more. What you said college graduates earn more than high school graduates. Okay? So progressive tax does discourage investment in human capital, even if foregone earnings are the only costs of going to college. Okay? Any questions on that? All right. Now you can, I'm going to come a little later to ability, but suppose you had ability. And what ability does, let's think of it this way. It's not the way I'm actually going to think about it. But think of it this way. What ability does is, if I'm twice as able as somebody else, I increase my earnings at every, whether I'm a high school graduate or a college graduate. If I'm 20% above the mean, I increase my earnings by, let's say, 10%. So I get 10% more earnings because I have an IQ of 120 rather than an IQ of 100. I get 10% more earnings whether I go to college or not compared to the average guy. Okay? All right. Now let's say there's no tuition. And now let's look at my foregone earnings. And if my foregone earnings are going to, if I'm 20% of, my IQ is 120, my foregone earnings are 10% higher too. So I'm giving up more. I'm getting more, but I'm giving up equal in amount. So again, there'll be no effect on the incentive to go to college in that case. The more able wouldn't have any more incentive. Now, yet if we look at the data, we find the more able do go to college much more than the less able. So how are we going to explain that? We have to say something else in addition or different is going on. Either high IQ affects your earnings more at a higher level or when you have college education, or it affects your costs in some way other than simply on the foregone earnings effect. And that's the approach I'm going to take later on, the effect on cost side. But let's hold that, okay? But the same thing would go through in a simple model with ability, okay? Now, with a simple model with ability, you can see that's contradictory. The more able, at least by the measures of cognitive and other abilities, are more likely to go to college. So you have to say, well, that means the ability variable can't work this way. It has to work in a more complicated way. With a tax rate, whether flat tax affects the incentive to go to college or not, well, first of all, we don't know very much about that. I mean, it's a good question, but not much is known about that. Although there are some countries in the world that do have flat taxes. Maybe 15 to 20 countries of the world have flat taxes, like the Baltic countries, Russia, Hong Kong, and some others. But, I mean, maybe people will study that. I don't know of any studies. Okay. Secondly, we would say, well, even in the flat tax, maybe there's tuition's important. You got to worry about that. Or then you have to worry, how does the progressive tax affect the incentive to go to college? I don't think we know about that either, in terms of good empirical studies. The theory is pretty clear, but I don't know if we have the good empirical studies. Yeah.
So here it seems you have modeled the tax rate to depend on the wage rate and not earnings. Because if you make it depend on earnings, I think the prediction of a progressive tax rate is not so clear, right? Because if you go to college, you have less earnings in your first year, and then, dependent on the tax regime, it might actually make you more likely to go to college.
Well, is it a flat tax?
No, with the progressive tax.
Progressive tax. Well, we have progressive tax, yes, so let's work it through. I mean, first of all, we'd have to worry about how many hours of work. Let's say the same hours of work after college as everybody else. All right, so then it's clear the benefit effect is working against going to college. And now, if we look at the foregone earnings, okay, so foregone earnings, you are going to be, what, you're going to be taxed less. Yeah, so let's look at the foregone earnings, okay. Let's say the tax rate here will be a function of t times that and t times that, right? That's the formulation. That makes sense. That usually we tax earnings. It doesn't make any difference here because, I mean, it makes a difference because you raise everything else, but not qualitatively. Now, if we go to the other side, we would have some other tau. 1 minus tau of t, how many hours have we worked? T minus tc times wh, right? So that's going to be a lower tax here because the earnings are lower, right? So foregone earnings, maybe in the extreme case, there'll be no tax. Take the extreme case. No tax on that, so you don't change foregone earnings, okay? You don't change foregone earnings, all right? But you do lower benefits. So, unless I'm missing something, okay, and I'm going to look at it again. So in that case, the low income, the foregone earnings level is, let's say foregone earnings, there's foregone earnings, I have no, let's say I'm not paying any tax, say I'm not paying any tax on my foregone earnings, right? So, paying any tax on my foregone earnings, right? That would be, what?
I mean, my idea was essentially, the extreme case would be, if you go to college and work less, because you have less earnings, you don't pay any taxes. But if you finish after high school, and have since you have full high school earnings, then you pay taxes. So then.
Well, let's say you go to college. What's your model?
Okay.
Is T affected, capital T? If you go to college, is capital T the same for the high school and college graduates?
After the first period, yes.
Yeah, okay. All right, now what about in the
Just
first
like
period?
in the first period, you work less when you go to college, right? So you have
Definitely.
more earnings.
I have that. T minus
Yeah,
TC is
okay.
less.
And then say you have like an extreme case of progression that you don't pay any taxes when you go to college in the first period because you earn less and then you are below some threshold.
Let's say you don't pay any taxes.
Yeah, okay. But
You don't pay any, it could be very progressive, so you don't pay any taxes.
Yeah, but if you go to high school, then you're above that threshold, so you pay taxes. So
Yeah,
that's actually then.
you do, but,
decreasing
okay,
your
so,
costs.
all right, so what we should do here, yeah, I see what I wasn't doing. The way we should do it is the following. Yeah, this should come out. I didn't do it quite right here. What we should do here is, let's write out this whole equation. So we have here, if we look at the foregone earnings, what is the foregone earnings? Foregone earnings before anything else is W, let's say H naught times T minus W H naught times T minus TC, right? That's the model we want. Okay, so now I'm asking what's going to happen to foregone earnings. Well, let's say this part is going to be reduced, and this part isn't changed at all. That's what you want to say, right? This part is going to be reduced, and that part isn't going to change at all. So your foregone earnings go down in that case, right? As your benefits go down. Yeah, that's the right case. No, that's definitely right. And could it go down enough? Yeah, I suppose if you I think you're right. If you have, it depends on the tax schedule, but if you have a schedule that's the only degree of progressivity is that there's low incomes are not taxed. Take that extreme case, and everything else is flat, right? So this is all flat here, so they go down by, let's say, the tax is 10%. Okay, they go down by 10%. In this particular case, where am I? this guy isn't taxed at all. Okay, this guy earnings go down by 10%, right? And so this whole thing goes down by more than 10%, right? Right, it'll go down by more than 10%. So if you're subtracting something that's unchanged, let's do the arithmetic. I mean, this is just now plain arithmetic. Subtracting something that's unchanged from something that goes down by 10%, yes, and the whole thing goes down by more than 10%, and then there'll be a gain. Yeah, no, good example. And the rest you understand the example. You have it. I mean, this can hold more generally, but this is an extreme example. If your income falls below a certain amount, you don't pay any taxes. And if income is above that amount, you pay 10% on everything. I mean, most tax systems don't work exactly that way. You only pay on the margin, but you pay 10% on everything. Okay? So let's say with foregone earnings, your income is below that threshold. You're not paying anything in taxes. On what you're earning, but the high school guy's paying 10%, and the college and high school guys are all paying 10%, so divide through by that 10%, and you see on all of them, you're going to see you're increasing your incentive to go to college. So good point. Yeah. Now, you'll still have other progressive taxes where this will operate, and so you have to look at the structure. I mean, what this lesson is, you have to really look at the structure of the how the progressivity operates. Okay. Anything else? Now we have another factor. I think it's factor 5, self-deductible wage. So, you know, when people ask why you go to college, people, the first thing that, well, it wasn't always true that case. In the past, people would say, well, people went to college for cultural reasons. And when the human capital analysis began by economists, they were greatly attacked because people said, well, it's not earnings that motivates college attendance, it's other factors. You become more cultured, you read Shakespeare, right? My favorite, Jane Austen. I had to read Jane Austen, appreciate her writings, and a lot of other things like that. Cultural activity, you can learn how to speak a foreign language, but whatever it may be. But then the emphasis in the human, well, it's not really human capital. Human capital really treats a much broader problem, but the early work by economists bringing in human capital was on earnings. So now, first thing people mention, you get higher earnings when you go to college. And it certainly is an important factor. Okay? Moreover, if you look at what happened to earnings over time, in the U.S. and a number of other countries have been studied, they were pretty constant from the period like 1900 to 1970. You look at wage differential. By earnings, I mean wage differentials, percentage wage differentials between college and high school graduates. Not absolute wage differential. They grew a lot because incomes were growing. Percentage wage differentials were pretty constant between 1900 and 1970. They fell somewhat in the 1970s. And people began to then worry that we had overeducated Americans. And this is for the United States. I'm not sure if they fell. In the United States, they fell partly because, due to the Vietnam War, and you could be, your draft could be either exempt or deferred if you stayed in college. Many more people, men, were staying in college. And you can see that. It's very dramatic in the data. The enrollments of men went up a lot, not so much of women. So you don't have to be a genius to see that was the Vietnam War that was going on a lot. Okay, so you got more people going, but nevertheless, they were going to college, and that knocked down earnings. I mean, that's the interpretation now we give to it. In any case, people didn't know exactly what was the reason, and so a good economist, Richard Freeman, he was so good he used to be here for a while. So he was really a good economist. Wrote a book called The Overeducated Americans. He wrote that after he left Chicago. And it looked pretty good. If you looked at the data, he published it, I think, 1978 or 79. It looked pretty good. You looked at it, as of that time, you saw this downward trend in the benefits from going to college, earnings benefits. Well, just about when the book came out, everything started turning up. And you began to get a boom in the monetary gain from going to college. And it was really, literally, almost just about the time of the publication of the book, within a year or so. So if you look at the picture, in 1978, the average college graduate, 40% premium. Average college graduate. That means the average college graduate, that's the premium. So if the average high school graduate earned 100, the average college graduate earned 140. Okay. In 2010, that went to about 75%. If you look at, that's a huge increase. More rapid than in any other period that we have any evidence, recorded evidence for. Going back into the 19th century. That was really a dramatic change. It's even more dramatic when you look at people postgraduate. 1978, around 40% postgraduate compared to high school. Over high school. 2010, about 100%. So that grew even more than the other. Okay. So there was a big change. And that's been studied a lot. Some of you have read Murphy and Katz, Murphy and Welch, a bunch of papers. And Kevin Murphy was one of the important people who worked on this, first demonstrating this. And you can demonstrate this for a lot of countries, not just for the United States. So again, it wasn't unique to the United States, although the increase in the U.S. was greater than many other countries. But it's true in a lot of European countries, Latin American countries, like Brazil, Mexico, Chile. You can document it for all those countries. We have very limited data for India, but to the extent we have data, it's true in India. And it's certainly been true in China since the late 1980s, where we were beginning to get pretty good data for China. Okay? So it's a pretty general phenomenon. I'm not saying it's universal, but it's pretty general in the world. And what do you see as a result of that? You see a significant increase in the fraction of people going to college. All right? So simple economic analysis, here we would say we have over here WC over WH, over here number going to college. Here we have the demand curve. Think of the demand curve by the economy for college graduates as a function of their earnings relative to other skill levels. So one example is high school graduates. The amount of capital in the economy and the amount of technology, or the nature of the technology in the economy. And so what happens, if you say this is 1978, the usual interpretation is this is 2010. That there was a shift outward in the demand because a number of reasons. People stressed technology was what's called biased toward the more educated people, favored the more educated people. Maybe you think of computers and the internet and things of that type. You were shifting sectors that were used relatively intensively more educated people, like education and health, a significant shift toward these type of services that are intensive and more educated people. Maybe globalization. I think globalization was also important, which explains why, if you take the traditional theory of comparative advantage in international trade, you would predict, well, when you open up trade more extensively, countries that are relatively intensive in low-skilled labor, like China or India, their price of their low-skilled labor should rise relative to the high-skilled level. They shift to the low-skilled instead. That's classical, Heckscher-Ohlin international trade theory. And that's irrelevant, but it's not the only thing going on. There's also technology transfers, another thing that classical trade theory doesn't take into account. And the evidence suggests that even in developing countries, and China and India, China in particular is a great example because it went from being isolated in the world, and from a trade point of view, being a major exporter and so on, and mainly exporting low-skilled products for the most part. Nevertheless, in China, you found this increase in the returns, but not only in China, you see it in Brazil and a lot of other countries. So I'm not going to give a course on international trade theory, but it raises interesting questions for the theory. But whatever reason, you see this big increase in returns, so you have a shift in the demand curve. And then even if supply wasn't shifting, we'll come to that later, think of the first order effect is this is your equilibrium, 40% premium. I mean, 140 and 180, right? Well, the ratio 1.4, 1.8. Okay? That's a simple interpretation of what went on over this period. So if this is right, you should see an increase in wages associated with an increase in supply. I mean, that sounds so elementary, but it's an elementary part of economics that's useful in understanding this. So we see, when you look at the data, you see, yes, a significant increase in fraction going to college all over the world. And if you look at whatever data when we get on that, you see a significant increase in the benefits. So you think it was mainly, not only necessarily mainly a demand shift. Well, you look at U.S. history. You look at U.S. history from 1900 to 1970. Look at U.S. history from 1900 to 1970. Okay, 1900, 1970, wage college over wage. More or less flat. So the interpretation that has usually been given to that has been, well, you had demand shifts, it's shifting out, there's no question. Well, number going to college, and supply has been shifting out. So supply and demand were shifting out about equally, and you kept things flat. So if you look at the book by Katz, Golden and Katz, any of you familiar with that book on U.S. determinants of U.S. education? Right? You know it?
Yeah, they talk about the race between technology and education.
Yeah, right. This is what they end up with for that period of time. Okay? This didn't happen, at least yet, since 1980. So we're going to have to discuss that somewhat, why this looks different. Now, it may be you had bigger shifts out in demand, or you had smaller shifts out in supply. I mean, it has to be one of these two forces at work. Okay, but certainly the increase in earnings has been important. So the increase in rate, there's been a significant increase in rates of return on education. Another way to put it is rates of return have gone up. Now, okay, I mean, people, one should worry about, are these really rates of return, or is it a selection out of people into college and high school? A lot of literature on that. I'll come back and discuss that a little bit. And most of that literature is not able to make it go away by any adjustments for the quality of the people going to college. In fact, some of the literature has, when you tried instrumenting with twins and other ways, you get higher rates of return. So I say, I don't know if you get higher, but just comparing the OLS, which is basically just comparing the averages, let's say, of college and high school graduates, average earners, seems to be a pretty good approximation to what's going on. Okay? Now, the people who look at the data, particularly non-economists, say, well, over this period of time, you had a big increase in tuition. Okay? And you did. Tuition's growing at high rates. If you look at all the college newspapers, they're always complaining about the increase in tuition. They never mention the increase in benefits that have gone along and why more people are going to college despite the increase in tuition, right? So what does it mean? Two things, I would say, and this will be the last thing we'll do today. Yeah. The increase, we would predict an increase in tuition at a really rapid rate. Why? Eric?
Well, I mean, you need educated people to educate new people in colleges or something. So
We need educated people to produce cars too.
well, I think it's relatively intensive.
Okay.
Yes.
We know education is a really intensive sector. Look at the University of Chicago, all the teachers pretty much have PhDs. You look at high school, K-12 schools, they tend to at least have a college graduate, so they're above average. And that's true in almost every country. Teachers are above average in the education level relative to their country. And so it's not surprising if the earnings of college graduates are rising really rapidly, the relative cost of producing this product, namely education, is going to rise relatively. Now, whether that can entirely explain this, I don't know. I don't know if anybody's really tried to tease that out, but that would be my first order way of approaching that problem. How much can I get out of this, and then see if there's something else that's been going on. Other people have argued maybe in addition, the quality of education has been going up. But certainly the first order would be the costs are going up. But the second factor is that, come back now to financing problem. Those people have a big financing problem. It doesn't show up in our analysis, but if tuition's rising is high, how are you going to, what's your consumption going to be while you're in college? You're giving out all this money, what do you have left over? And so you tend to squeeze out, if anybody, the people who have most trouble with financing a college education are lower income people. And if you look at the data, the increase in college attendance from some low income groups, for the U.S. at least, has not been as high as for some other groups. So that's some evidence that, yeah, maybe the capital forces are operating. Okay. But overall, it's certainly, even for those groups, there's been an increase in fraction attendance. You don't find the reverse. So the benefits are dominating for them, but maybe less so, would be my conclusion. Okay, so why don't we pick up from here on Thursday. Remember, the midterm is a week from this Thursday, not this Thursday.